Hi everyone. My article was by Elizabeth Gude, I think that's how you pronounce her last name, and it's called Postmodern Principles in Search of a 21st Century Art Education. I'm sorry I can't be with you tonight. I would have loved to have a conversation with you about this article because I think it touches on some very important topics and relates a lot to what we've been speaking about in class in terms of the content that we are teaching in our art curriculum. I gave it the subtitles, The Limits of Formalism Within Cultural Contexts and Meaning Making in Art Education, and Why 7 Elements and 7 Principles Are Not Enough. So we'll go further into that next. So in this article, Gude asks, why are we still teaching the elements of art and principles of design as if they are the essence of art making? We are all familiar with the 7 elements of art and the design principles. In the article, she refers to them as the 7 and 7 plus 7. I put these 2 quotes here because I think they encapsulate what she's talking about. I ponder the piles of exercises on line, shape, or color harmonies left behind by hundreds and hundreds of students each year. I wonder why what is still considered by many to be the appropriate organizing content for the foundations of 21st century art curriculums is but a shadow of what was modern, fresh, and inspirational 100 years ago. Gude talks about the elements of art and principles of design as being modern, fresh, and inspirational 100 years ago. And the Bauhaus is actually a perfect example of why that was true. At the Bauhaus, focusing on line, shape, color, balance, and form was actually radical at the time. Artists were breaking away from decorative traditions, academic realism, and historical styles. Reducing art to its essential visual components, what it looked like, what you could see, felt new, experimental, and forward-thinking at the time. And those elements of art and principles of design gave artists a shared visual language to invent something that didn't exist yet. Modern design, modern architecture, modern visual culture. And in that context, the seven weren't restrictive. They were liberating. And they helped artists imagine a new world then, 100 years ago. Her problem with the 7-7 system is that these ideas were developed in Western modernist traditions that prioritized visual form, composition, and aesthetic harmony. And by focusing on these elements, it turns art education into a sort of visual checklist instead of understanding the origins of artworks and the cultural understandings and original meaning. It turns it into a comparison to Western norms instead of appreciating cultural traditions and values, and detaches aesthetic judgment rather than finding relational meaning making. The big problem that Gude is addressing is that traditional art education relies heavily on a Euro-American outdated formal system. It treats art as objects to analyze rather than cultural practices to understand. Gude argues that this limits how students understand art, including their own art and art from non-Western cultures. Essentially, that when it comes to non-Western art, we are stripping it of its original meaning and just seeing it for face value, what it looks like, analyzing it formally. And the same happens to their work. By looking at it through the lens of the 7-7 formal system, you're stripping the work of its meaning and just looking at how it looks. So in terms of the student art, ideas become overshadowed by formal description. Gude identifies a clear mismatch between what students are making and what teachers are trained to talk about. Gude is actually talking about work made by teenage students, upper grade students, but this resonated with me because, you often, I teach elementary, and you often think that you know what a student drew, and of course we are taught to not say, oh, you drew a beautiful butterfly or a tree, because for all you know, it might be a volcano or something completely different than what you assumed. So one way we tackle that is by analyzing it formally. And that helps us. That's a tool for us because we are not going to make a mistake and mortify the student by assuming that they created something that they assumed you knew. They thought you knew what they think we know what they're creating at a young age, but we kind of break their hearts when we tell them it's something different. But when it comes to upper grade students, this formal analyzation or interpretation, when you're looking at their work, can often strip the meaning from the student's work. I guess that's what she's saying. So the traditional language of elements and principles focus on surface qualities of form and fails to describe conceptual strategies and intentions. And as a result, significant student meaning goes unnamed. When it comes to non-Western art, the cultural implications are that the 7-7 principles are a Euro-American formal system and way of looking at art from other cultures, and it strips the work of their aesthetic context and prevents students from learning about how art is valued in other cultures and the meaning that is attached to it, and therefore becomes detached from community, purpose, and use. We can think of African masks or tapestries, Native American tapestries, and how this could play out if we look at them formally and ignore their history and the context within which they were created. They become culturally stripped. So viewing art from other cultures through the lens of 7-7 Euro-American system of describing form does not allow students to learn the aesthetic context of making and valuing inherent to the artists and communities who actually created the works. So she argues that the need for a new art education principles should go beyond mastering design elements and students should learn how to reflect on social, cultural, and political contexts, how to engage with identity and community, and this new set of principles should encourage multiple perspectives rather than universal truths. She calls for educational frameworks that align with contemporary art practices. So what she proposes instead, this continuation. So actually in 1995, she held a workshop called the Spiral Workshop. She was trying to come up with a curriculum for a Saturday art class for youths. And before creating the curriculum, which was made in collaboration with teachers in training, she decided on a criteria. Her criteria was based on these 3 bullet points here, which can expand how, her intention was that the criteria should expand how art can be understood, discussed, and taught. This criteria addresses meaning-making strategies and not just formal appearance. They are curriculum that is based on generative themes relative to the lives of students and their communities, studio art projects based on diverse practices of contemporary art making and related traditional arts, and art as investigation, understanding the art of others and seeing their own art making, students' own art making, not just as exercises, but as research that produces new visual and conceptual insights. So in art class, instead of repeating exercises on value or color theory, their practice and their work should be seen as work that leads to more work, investigative and thoughtful. So her postmodern principles, we'll get to that soon, Following the spiral workshops, she was appointed a Great Cities faculty scholar at the University of Illinois in Chicago, where she worked on a year-long project called the Contemporary Community Curriculum Initiative. And she introduced art teachers to the spiral workshop philosophy that we just talked about, that criteria, and she linked the teachers with contemporary artists. In reflecting on the curriculum that resulted in her initiative in Chicago, there were 25 projects that resulted in that initiative, and upon reflection, she identified 8 categories that describe the student's artwork and creative process. It was originally 15, but she saw that some were overlapping and reduced it down to 8. She wants to make clear that these 8 postmodern principles are not meant to replace the elements of art and principles of design. It's not a new checklist, and it's not a new canon. Instead, they are meant to broaden what counts as art knowledge, legitimize multiple cultural frameworks, and help students articulate complex meanings. They're intended to be built upon, added to, and changed over time and revisited. These are her 8 principles that she found by looking at what took place over that year in Chicago and looking at common themes that came up in students' work and their processes of creating, and in relation to contemporary art and how artists are practicing today or back then in 2000. So they are appropriation, juxtaposition, recontextualization. I find the first 3 to be very, very similar, so you have to read them carefully to understand their difference. And then we have layering, hybridity, text and image, representing, and gazing. And they are themes and principles that have to do with the process in which the students were working and the finished product. Because I find it interesting to think about what it means to place 2 images next to each other as in juxtaposition, the act of placing the images together, and then the artist walking away and leaving it for the audience to discover what the new relationship means. So she, in creating these principles, included both process and product. So her main argument, or my takeaway, is that when art education relies too heavily on Euro-American formalist systems, such as the elements of art and principles of design, it limits students' ability to understand meaning, context, culture, and especially in how artists are working today, and work that we may not understand from a Western perspective. And that 21st century art education must make room for multiple ways of knowing, and teach students to interpret art within lived cultural frameworks, which we are all familiar with, because when we talk about motivational dialogue and inspiring students to create, we are asking them to tap into their own experience and bring that to the creative process. And this is very much the same thing. The elements of art and principles of design, I feel like their meaning has shifted in 21st century art education, from their original intention as a source of inspiration and a step away from representational work, and to what today I feel like today they could be seen as tools and less of inspiration, in the sense of just another art material. Like a line can be seen as an art material. Form can be seen as an art material. Value, an art material, something that we are using to convey a deeper message or meaning, something that we are using to represent these experiences that we're asking students to tap into. And I will leave you with these discussion questions. I'm once again sorry I can't be there to discuss with you, because I find this topic to be very interesting and relative to our class discussions. Thanks for listening. I hope it made sense. I'm sorry for stumbling over my words, and I'll see you guys next week.